I should ask everyone if that's okay, at the board. All right.
So we do have one on item 11.4. Randy Shinga.
Okay, so somebody brought this up, on CUSD discussed. So there was another presentation, August 16th, 16. And the numbers, things like beginning balance are quite a bit different than, than here we are 3 months later. And a lot of the other numbers are quite a bit different. But the big thing I think needs to be answered is that the one 3 months ago said the board reserve cannot be maintained past 2019-20. And the one today says that the board reserve cannot be maintained past 2018-19. So in 3 months, the reserve basically, the day of reckoning is moved up by a year. And then it says the impact, it also says the impact of 16-17 or subsequent collective bargaining agreements is not included in the projections. So, I guess that's a question that I would like answered is if you took reasonable numbers for collective bargaining, or even a range, what would that do to the projected impacts? Because this is pretty important. It seems to me that you guys are running out of money, or we're running out of money, as the case may be.
Thanks. Chris?
Okay. So, kind of segue off of what Randy was talking about. Since the last time I shared with you, we had reported to the board, basically again, a snapshot of where we were, and at that point in time, we had not closed the books yet. And so the big question about why is the beginning number different than what the beginning number is as of now. So I put on your desk, and there were some copies up here, the slide from the meeting back in September. This was back in August, I'm sorry, back in August. And so at that point in time, we were estimating 16-17 to start with at about $25 million. You can see that on there. So just remember that number because it's not the same number that I'm going to show you in a few minutes. And the reason is that we had not closed the books yet. So this was still the information I shared with you in September, or August, was based on what we had shared with you when we adopted the budget in June. So again, a budget is only as good as the assumptions you have at that point in time. So with that, we'll start off with the presentation. So we are at that point in time where the first interim report. So this is a snapshot in terms of where we are as far as our fiscal solvency. Fiscal solvency is looked at it from the standpoint of whether or not you can meet your fiscal obligations not only just in 1 year, but actually over a period of 3 years. So let me go back. Tonight basically is a preliminary update. We normally bring to you the first interim report at our December meeting. But because of the urgency in terms of some of the numbers, I went to Wendy and I felt that it was prudent that we have this conversation now. We will be able to have the same conversation at our next meeting in December because we will actually have the first interim completed. So with Julia being out, I was pushing her to get everything as close as possible so I can have some information for you tonight. But that's exactly kind of where we are. We are just on the cusp of presenting the first interim. Again, it's that financial snapshot in terms of where we are as of the end of October. We will do it again at snapshot at second interim, and they'll be reflecting everything as of January. So the changes. So this is basically what the differences are between what I presented to you in August. Again, August's presentation was still based on what was in the adopted budget. But since we've now closed the books, and obviously other things that materialize, I've identified all the changes in the budget. So this page here just identifies the changes with the revenue. Overall, the delta with the revenue, we saw an increase of about $107,000 of additional revenue in comparison to the adopted budget. As you can see here, there were some adjustments. I shared with the board in August that the one-time mandate money that we were estimating as part of the adopted budget, we had estimated based on the rate revision at the time, it was slightly higher. When the state actually adopted its budget, it came in a little less. So the adjustment lowered revenue projections down by about $400,000. We also had some additional revenues in other categories here, but pretty much self-explanatory, small amounts.
Chris?
Yes.
Just so that it's clear, not only the state decreased the mandatory, the $214 the state decreased that number per ADA, but we also, did we have a higher projection of students coming in May when you made that projection to what was that one of the reasons also for the decrease?
Correct.
Okay. And then, it's just curiosity, how did parcel tax decrease? That we just got new people who were asking for exemptions, or?
Yes. Okay, so these are the changes just with the revenue. So let's get a little deeper into the budget and look at the expenditure differences. So just on this page here, there was a difference of about $2.6 million of additional expenditures to the budget. About $1 million of these expenditures are actually a byproduct of monies that were actually carried over from last year. So let me take a moment to talk about that. So when we actually close the books, monies that are traditionally carried over from one year to the next, and it's primarily like federal dollars. At the local level, it would be like all the parent donation money. All of those monies are earmarked, and so what it means is whatever's accumulated at that point in time, whatever they don't spend by the end of the year, it carries over to the next year. So when we normally adopt the budget, we presume that we don't have any carryover because it's too big of a guess to estimate and adopt the budget on. So most of the difference between the $25 million and the revised beginning balance is $28 million. Most of that $3 million increase is because of carryover. But going back to the expenditures, about $1 million of this increase in expenditures is because of those carryover dollars that were not budgeted in the adopted budget. So I'm going to stop for a second to make sure people have any questions or advice. Okay, so just imagine this. I had $100 that I had left over from last year. I didn't spend it. That $100 gets to be carried forward to the next year. But in the adopted budget, I did not have a plan in there to spend the $100. So technically that $100 is still sitting in my bank account. Now that the new school year has started, I now have a plan to spend that $100. I'm now going to have an expenditure plan for the $100. So I now have to show that additional $100 that will be coming out of my bank account. So hopefully that analogy kind of explains. When you look at carryover, you don't budget an expenditure against the carryover until you know that you have an amount to carry over and that you have a plan to spend it. Okay? So a lot of the ones in green are the one-time expenditures. These were carryovers. So $556,000. A lot of that was site donation money. We have that amount of money that resides in the school accounts as far as all the donation money. So we have to carry that over. And a lot of these other things are new added costs. So there's about $92,000 of additional personnel costs related to transportation, and that was primarily due to the increased hours. We had increased the minimum hours for our bus drivers from, I think, less than 7 hours. They're now all 8 hours. So some of those things were not put in the budget at the time. Substitute teacher costs. When we actually closed out the year, we had budgeted that our substitute budget was about $1.3 million. That's what we budgeted. But when we actually closed out the year, we actually spent about $1.6 million in sub costs as of the close of the year. So the additional $350,000 was to reflect based on what we actually expended this last year, what we hope, well, what we believe might be the next year's total expense for purposes of budgeting. Other new costs, a fire alarm contract, $176,000. We also had some other miscellaneous budgets totaling about $300,000 of additional expenditures. So about $1.6 million of it is really new expenditures, on top of about $1 million of newly budgeted expenditures because of the carryover offset. There were an additional $1 million of expenditures tied to special education, about $809,000 of increased cost. When we adopted the budget, at that point in time, we did not have the salary changes or increases for behavioral therapists. Because we adopted our budget early in June, by the time we actually had negotiated this and got it to the board, it came about afterwards, so we did not have the time at that time to put into the budget. So that additional cost, and then obviously about $106,000 of additional special ed settlements have caused us to have to increase our special ed encroachment to about $917,000. Routine repair, mainly the $135,000, that was on tonight's item. The cost to cover the water costs for the city of Cupertino, that was not in the original budget, so that amounts there. So a total increase of about $1 million here just in the contributions to special ed and routine repair. And so here's that 5-year picture. And I applaud the board for looking at the 5-year picture, because the structural deficits that we're dealing with in the budget are things that are outside of our ability to control. It's those things around the STRS and PERS. For the audience, STRS and PERS are our public employees retirement system. And so with the changes with that, it's having a huge impact, because the employer contribution as well as the employee contribution continues to go up over that span of time, all the way up until 2021. So when you look at the changes, so for 16-17, I'm showing that we're going to be deficit spending about $4.1 million. About 1.5 of it to almost maybe 1.6 million of it is because of carryover one-time expenditures. When you have the one-time expenditures, obviously they'll start to drop off. But a lot of the ongoing deficits that we have are because of the decline of enrollment. One of the other changes is that when we based our budget this year, we were using Tom Williams' report. And when you look at it, it looks like the decline that Tom was already projecting hit us a year earlier. We were looking at dropping down to about the level where we are today, but Tom's projection was actually for next year. So we dropped about 100 more kids than what Tom had projected. So with that saying, we've now factored that into the multi-year projection because of that additional decline. And the other things I wanted to point out, and actually there was an error on my slide, and I apologize. On your slide, in your handbook, it said board reserve cannot be maintained past 2018-19. As you can see here, I corrected it, and I apologize again. I'm showing, based on this scenario, board reserve can't be maintained past 2017-18. So let's remind everyone, the board reserve is the additional reserve over the 3% requirement for economic uncertainty. So our board right now, we have about $6 million of our board of our reserve requirement right here. So when I say that the district cannot maintain the board reserve past 17-18, I'm showing here. So 16-17 is here. Next year, 17-18. As you can see here, it goes from $11.8 million reserve, $11.8 million reserve, drops down to $5.9 million reserve. And that again is because of the ongoing deficit. So under this scenario, we can maintain our 3% reserve by ed code. But then I added this last line, and reserve for economic uncertainty becomes a challenge past, I still made a mistake, 18-16, got rid of 18-19. 18-19, past 18-19, here's the challenge. Our reserve requirement based on $200 million is $6 million. But based on this continued deficit spending, we're showing that our ending balance is less than $6 million. So we have to address 19-20 as well, because we would not, under this scenario, have our 3% reserve requirement. And again, please keep in mind, these are just a budget based on a set of assumptions now. Come January, in 2 months, I'm gonna be coming to the board with a whole different set of assumptions, because things change. So really, when you look at it, really, we have a structural deficit problem that we have to deal with. We have to stay ahead of this year, 18, 19, and 19, 20. For us to maintain 18, 19 with our current reserve at about $11.8 million, we need about $6 million by the end of 18, 19, or looking at about $3 million of ongoing cuts starting in 17, 18. So imagine 17, 18, if we can identify about $3 million reduction of the budget, changes that number significantly. Now $3 million compounds, it becomes $6 million this year, $9 million the third year, and now the fourth year, $12 million. But by saving $3 million in 17, 18, and another $3 million in 18, 19, that puts $6 million back on that line item.
So let me summarize and make sure I think I've got what you're saying. First of all, I am gonna say that I think the fact that we do 5 years when all we're required to do is 3 years is a big deal. And we did this a couple years ago because we knew that the STRS and PERS increase was gonna happen at the tail end and that the incoming revenue was gonna flatline. And we knew this was gonna happen, so this was a way of being able to look at it and be able to proactively deal with it. So what I'm hearing is, one, that the enrollment dropped faster than we thought, which I find somewhat ironic when people think we don't have a decreasing enrollment. So that's a hit, and the fact that the enrollment's dropped, I think we just next year have to be really careful. You know, is that next year's drop, or are we just on a faster slope than we thought? And so just something to be careful and conservative about. We negotiated costs, and we knew that we were doing that in 2 areas, one in bus drivers and the other in our special ed IAs. And we had to, because we couldn't get employees. And I think that's a direct result of the cost of living increases and the cost of housing in this area. And some of our lower paid employees simply weren't, they were leaving. And they were leaving because the salaries weren't enough to attract them. So now you're gonna have to deal with the fact that, you know, there's pressure on the bottom end of the salary schedule for our lowest paid employees, which we've dealt with. And I think every coffee we went to, someone asked why we didn't have more buses and more bus drivers, and well, here's why. You know, we've tried to increase those salaries to keep them, but I don't think you can add any more than you already have. No COLA hurts. I think moving forward, the fact that we are flatlined in public education funding hurts, and I think it's, you know, we all need to kind of say thank you to the voters for extending Prop 30, because if they hadn't extended that, we'd be looking at cuts right now. And so that's a positive. But the fact that there's no COLA is something that, as we deal with the increase in STRS and PERS, almost every district's gonna have kind of that issue. And that STRS and PERS is just a real kicker. And we're not the only district with that issue. As I talk to other board members up and down the state, primarily small school districts. The rural school districts they can't close their budget. And it'll be interesting to see 2-3 years down the road whether the state actually looks at this or whether we really are gonna have to absorb it again. For anyone who's listening, the STRS and PERS costs by the time we go from 8% to the 18% of payroll is roughly 1/3 of the LCFF money that we've gotten. It's huge. It's a huge hit. And then my favorite line is, it's the state teachers retirement fund, yet the state isn't paying for it. Teachers and staff are paying for it, and employers are paying for it, not the state. So it's an issue. The sub costs that are higher, that one I'm not quite sure. That one, I don't know how you deal with that. You have to think about that one. And the special ed costs, boy, we're really gonna have to look at that. So, a lot of work, moving forward.
I forgot to also add, Randy had asked the question about why can't you presume in your budget that there's some cost of living increase for our employees and build that in the budget?
We never do.
Well, what we factor in here basically is what we know right now, based on what's been negotiated, salary, schedule, step, and column. What you're asking about, can we just go ahead and say, oh, let's put 3% in there? What happens is that it could be interpreted as, what's the word?
Bargaining.
Bargaining. It could be an unfair bargaining complaint against the district. So that's the reason why. I mean, we presume what we know based on what we've negotiated today. But if I was to go ahead and say, well, we're gonna presume that there's gonna be a 3%.
Right.
And it'd be a kind of, it could be a cause for an unfair bargaining.
Districts don't do it that way. You gotta go, Ben? Sure.
Yeah, I just wanna, cause Joe was talking about what's happening, across the state. So even going back 2 years in the county, they were telling me I was saying the sky was falling. I kept warning everybody, because I said you need to go out more years, because districts are bargaining and, you know, money is being dispensed. And I said, what's gonna end up happening is we're all gonna have to pull back. We were actually positioned in a way, where we didn't see that coming until out, if you go back several years, but with our projections that, you know, the decline hitting us a little harder, it's coming obviously earlier. We started cutting little bits last year, and now we're gonna have to go into a mode, and we're already beginning our thinking about what we have to do. And Chris is doing that work with budget advisory, but it's happening across the state right now because money was put into supplemental funding. And what I had said was we're all gonna be in trouble because no one's paying attention to the LCFF base. Districts were happy because they got supplemental money, but what's happened now is they can't use that money. That money was not intended for the purposes of basic salary and to pay stirs and PERS. That's not the intent, and now people are running into, districts across the state are running into, big and small, because when I was there at the last meeting, I was with like districts like Norco Corona, and they're saying, hey, we're all in trouble. And so, because it's beginning to happen, we're seeing declines of students across the entire county. So we have other districts in the county in the same boat where there's declining enrollment and increased costs. And those two, as Chris has told us year after year, every time he presents, when those two lines cross, where the revenue is going to go down, expenditures are naturally going up to what the state did. So we're not in a place where we can stabilize or normalize until 2021, because that's when we'll be back to basically that COLA concept. So if there's a cost of living, great, you can negotiate that, you can add based on that, and it's predictable. Right now, we've lived in an unpredictable state for the last, 5 years now, 5 years, which is the state telling us each year, well, we'll give you this much, maybe not. We're gonna accelerate your revenues, and that was dangerous when they accelerated the revenue. Because they accelerated the revenue to the point where now the revenue coming in can't cover that increased stirs and PERS. And they might have thought that was a great thing to do years ago, and they told us, not only are we gonna increase those revenues, but you can't put them in reserves, remember that, right? You can't stockpile. So it was an odd time in educational budgeting across the state, because two messages: we're giving you the money early, you can't stockpile it, but your costs are gonna come later. And all of that was wrong, and it happened, and now here we are. So here, we were lucky, very fortunate that there's a board policy that says we do have some level of reserve there that's guaranteed across time. So unless there's an emergency, and what this is telling us is we're gonna be facing that real soon if we don't get to work and cut back. Which, we will do, obviously, but it is a condition that's happening throughout any district that's not basic aid.
So I'm gonna turn to the board and ask for questions, comments. Phyllis, go ahead.
I just have a comment about the reserve. I am really concerned about our board reserve. We worked really hard to get it in the books back in when we had the mid-year cuts. We had Tiffin that raised money for us. We had furlough days, thanks to our staff that were willing to take them. So we didn't have to have layoffs, but everybody had to take a little bit less money that year. I don't ever want to miss that again. So I want to preserve this reserve. I'm not going to say at any cost, but pretty close. So I hope that the Budget Advisory Committee will come up with some recommendations for us that will allow us to cut that $3 million a year without laying off personnel, without affecting the students any more than we have to. so that we can maintain that, so we never have to do the furlough days and the other things that we went through during those mid-year cuts. That was horrible. So, just my 2 cents.
Anybody else wanna weigh in? No? Okay, so I think, this is just for
It's information,
information,
yeah.
right? Yep. I appreciate that. All right, so